We're now going to start our third day. Absolutely fantastic to see so many of you here. We're really looking forward to this afternoon's conversation. So just some housekeeping to start us off. We've had a really interactive and informative 2 days so far, and we've been delighted by the interest in this really important conversation today. And we're absolutely thrilled that our distinguished speakers are giving their time to share their expertise. We hope today brings a shared understanding of palliative and end-of-life care, the opportunity for collaboration and a real conversation that helps to develop an enriched insight into services which today are focusing on reclaiming the public understanding of dying. Everybody taking part will get the speaker contacts, PowerPoints, a CPD certificate and a link to YouTube for the recordings. So firstly, if I could ask throughout this afternoon that delegates mute themselves and turn off their cameras unless they are presenting. And also that we are recording the session, so by joining, unless there is something specific you don't want to be part of, the session will be recorded. If you have a question, please use the chat box. You can ask delegates to introduce themselves to you, to all of you. You can use that as a way to network, and it's also a way, if we don't have your details, if you put your details in there, we can also send you your CPD certificates. If you're using social media, please make sure you use our hashtag, which is hashtag capital E OL and then capital C and then for the Cornwall. The capital E is really important, so please use it accordingly. And we will mention the hashtag a few times because it would be great to have us trending. I think that's the right word. If you have any problems viewing the presenter and you want to have the whole page, you can pin a speaker by hovering over their name at the bottom left. And you have the option there of pinning or unpinning. Today is going to run slightly differently. Following the first presentation, this is then going to be an open debate with our panel all visible on the screen and a discussion. And then in the plenary, Gina is going to talk about our next conference in Dying Matters Week and our new community services newsletter coming out later in the spring. Anyone wanting to contribute to that, we will put the contact details in the chat. At the end of all sessions, if you want to share your organisation's work, all their contact details and PowerPoints, any films, again, we'll provide you with the details, but it is communityservices@cornwallhospice.co.uk. We will share everything in a week or so via a link and the recordings of the seminar and all of the information that you might need. Lolly is working on our survey for us, so the Survey Monkey will appear in the chat box. And that will really help us to evaluate the seminars, and any information, any feedback we would massively appreciate. So to start us off, we're absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Kathryn Mannix, Palliative Care Consultant and author of With the End in Mind. And over to you, Kathryn.
Thanks, Nikki, and hello, everybody. It's lovely to be here. I have a cup of tea, and I hope you do too. And I'm going to talk for a little while, but mainly I think we're going to benefit from talking to each other rather than having me speaking. So I'm just going to try and make my slides appear. We've practiced this once and everything appeared beautifully. And is it going to happen this time? Yes, it is. Look at that. Hurrah. I want us to think this afternoon about the public understanding of dying and how we who work in palliative and end-of-life care might be able to help a change in the understanding of public dying by adopting an attitude towards end-of-life care that is a little bit like midwifery. So where am I coming from? Well, I think that what we need to be able to do is to maintain that compassionate stance in a really practical way, as well as using data, and perhaps really importantly, using storytelling. Can I just say that somebody isn't muted, and I'm hearing noises down my microphone, so probably everybody else is as well.
Yes, and if you're not presenting, could you turn your camera off, i.e. if you're not Kathryn. Thank you. Sorry, Kathryn.
No, that's fine. I just didn't want somebody else to not know that whatever it is they're doing, we can all hear you. So here's Dame Cicely, and one of her most wonderful quotes: "How people die remains in the memories of those who live on." And what we've discovered over COVID, in fact, is that there is a step that's worse than that, which is how people die is not in the memory of those who live on because they weren't able to be there. And what they imagine, because they don't know what ordinary dying looks like, is probably very much worse than what has actually happened. I also think that we've reached a stage in our kind of cleverness as human beings where we've stopped seeing dying as part of living. And I really like this quote, which is, "A life well lived includes a death well planned," that we are living until the very moment that we die, which again is, to paraphrase Cicely, that's not cleverness of mine at all. So I'm going to use a little bit of data, but I'm mainly going to use stories. So I'm going to start with a story and data at the same time. Look at that. So this is life expectancies at birth since the middle of the 1850s. And this is put together by the Office for the National Statistics on a rolling basis every decade, and the decade starts again this year. So the most recent data finished in 2011, but in about 18 months' time, we'll have the next step in this graph, which will finish in 2021. And what you can see is life expectancy at birth being in people's 40s until the turn of the 20th century. And people were dying of what we would now consider to be preventable causes. That massive increase over the first half of the 20th century is largely about living conditions getting better. So people were less likely to die in childhood, which of course childhood deaths bring the whole average life expectancy down. But then you can see another change in that curve in the second half of the 20th century, and that's about healthcare advances. So Annie was born in 1900. She was born in not one of the best parts of Liverpool, and she was my grandmother. She was my nana. And when she was born in 1900, life expectancy at birth for girls, as you can see here, was in the late 40s, early 50s, and probably less than that for girls who were born into poverty. So it was really handy having a nana whose birthday year was 1900, because we always knew how old she was going to be. She was the same age as the year. And by the time she was in her mid-30s, she had had the life experience of end of life that people had had for the previous hundreds of years. She had seen siblings die when she was a child. She had nursed her parents through their last illnesses that we might associate with older age now, when they were themselves in their 40s and 50s following this curve. One of her children had died of a disease we routinely prevent with immunisation in children now, diphtheria, and her husband had died of sepsis after a ruptured appendix. So by the mid 1930s, she was a widow with a baby on the way, 3 other surviving children, and a war about to start. In the late 1990s, when she was reflecting with me about the things that had surprised her, there were 2 particular things that we talked about. One was the fact that she had outlived her life expectancy so enormously. And that was at least partly because when she was 48, which of course was in 1948, healthcare became available to everybody regardless of their income when the National Health Service began. And also, of course, all of those developments in the second half of the 20th century, better chemotherapy, better antibiotics, anesthetics that meant we could do more complicated surgery, so we could save lives that previously might have been lost for people who were in the prime of their lives, and restore them back to health, give them back to their children to continue parenting them to adulthood, put them back into work so that they could contribute to the public good through their taxation. All of those things were absolutely fantastic goods. The difficulty was that it meant that anybody who was so sick that they might die, instead of staying at home to die, which was previously obviously the thing to do, now would be sent to hospital. And we continued to send people who were sick enough that they might die into hospital, even when they were unlikely to be able to be rescued, because they were very elderly, because they had multiple comorbidities. So what had happened over my nana's lifetime was that her children, my mum and her siblings, had not been old enough to remember their dad dying or their brother dying, and had not had another close family bereavement. And they were now in their 60s. In the space of a single generation, Britain and British people forgot what ordinary dying looked like. So that's the situation that we are now dealing with. Now, we've always used stories to tell the most difficult things. We tell about the loss of childhood innocence and about danger. We talk about death in parables and metaphors like the Sleeping Beauty. We talk about love that is different and othered in stories like, in case you can't see the other, there he is, there's the Frog Prince. We talk about immortality being a curse, and there's the Little Mermaid giving up her tail in order to have legs, giving up her immortality in order to be able to pursue her love of a mortal. And the stories of the American Indians who death wasn't a thing. People slept for a period of time, and then the whirlwind came and blew their spirit back into them, and they reanimated. And it was realized by one of the braves that actually there would not be sufficient resources if they carried on having babies for the dead to continue to be revived. And so he closed the door of the teepee and stopped the whirlwind reanimating the dead. And he was driven out for that act, and he is still an outcast, and his name was Coyote. So we've got these myths that we've had since time immemorial, including modern myths. Here's the little boy who survived because his parents' love was greater than death. And yet Voldemort, the force for death, cannot be named. So we've perpetuated these myths and these stories, and now we have new death myths all of our own. So any of you who follow the soaps will know that death is a recurring plot line. If you look at the end of a season, in fact, what you find is that each of the soaps produces a little YouTube video of the deaths during that previous year. And you can find, for example, Albert Square has become a progressively more dangerous postcode to live in over the last couple of decades. But the deaths are almost always unlikely. The deaths are almost always trivialized and yet sensationalized. They're not showing people what ordinary dying looks like. There are noble exceptions, and Coronation Street's Siobhan storyline a couple of years ago was outstanding in that regard. We know that this is important. In Peru, where they're struggling with finding organ donors, the government asked their two most popular soaps to incorporate kidney transplant stories during 2018, and that trebled organ donation rates in Peru over the following year. So people do take notice of their soap operas. It does make a difference to public understanding. It's not that we don't like death, but what we want to do is be entertained by it. So people play gory computer games. They terrify themselves with zombies movies. And yet at the same time, they don't know which of the newspaper headlines they're getting are actually telling them the truth. So if you just think about newspaper headlines and air travel, if the only thing that you knew about air travel was what you read in the newspapers, you would never get on a plane, because they never report the plane that takes off more or less on time, arrives at the right airport, and everybody gets off again in one piece. So the public is bamboozled by unreliable information, and perhaps the most difficult of the death myths we currently have to deal with is this one, the CPR myth, that somehow CPR is a cure for death. And the idea that CPR is a temporary first aid measure that's suitable when somebody with an otherwise reasonably healthy body has a crisis during which their heart stops first. Everything else is still working. If you can keep things going, if you can keep the circulation going, you've got about a 1 in 10 chance of saving that person's life. So the public don't realise that the chances are as low as 1 in 10. They don't realise that it's a very particular first aid manoeuvre, and they think that it's the equivalent of the process of dying, during which the organs one by one shut down until breathing stops, and then finally, a few minutes after breathing has stopped, the heart stops last. That is not an indication for CPR. But because the public don't understand that difference, we constantly have this difficulty about having discussions about what we will and won't be able to offer, and what care would or would not be appropriate at the very end of somebody's life. So here we are trying to deliver a service where the public is misinformed, media distorts ordinary dying, people aren't seeing ordinary dying at home. Or I do public talks and people come up to me at the end and they say, "Do you know, when my mum died, it sounds strange to say, but it was really lovely. It was very gentle, and we were all there, and we had this beautiful experience of being able to be with her. And she didn't seem to suffer, and she seemed to be mainly unconscious, and then her breathing changed, and then it just very gently stopped." But we never tell people that, because we know that our experience was unusual, and most people have a terrible time. And I need them to go out and, like the rest of us, be people who talk about what they saw, ordinary dying. That is the normal experience. That's the equivalent of the plane that takes off on time and lands safely, that nobody is talking about. We can't keep trying to change this one family at a time. This is absolutely a public health issue. And I think we need to think about, how are we going to get our stories out there? So stories, of course, aren't just in books anymore. So there are some fantastic podcasts, and some of you might be aware of some of these. So You, Me and the Big C, which is run by Radio 5 Live and originally started by one of their journalists, Rachel Bland, and another couple of women cancer bloggers. And Rachel has subsequently died, and her husband has taken her place in that podcast. And they have a fantastic following of people talking about all sorts of things to do with metastatic disease, end of life care, dating, sex, all those things that nobody wants to talk about. Wonderful community supporting each other. There are wise people talking about their own individual stories. Beautiful pieces of journalism from Elliot Dallin just before he died of an endocrine tumour towards the end of 2020. And these fantastic books by people in the public eye talking about their personal journeys. And each of these is an absolutely fantastic read. They take a very particular view, though, because each of those is a single view, if you like. It's a single person's lens of their own journey. Whereas what we have to offer to the public is a single person's lens of lots and lots of journeys, so that we're able to distill what are the things that are different and special about individuals, but what are the things that are the same about the process that they're going through. So just take a moment now to think, how many people have you looked after at the very end of their lives? And you might be surprised when you really stop and think about the caseload of the services that you've worked in over your career, and the number of people whose deaths have been approaching while you've been looking after them. And what are the patterns that you recognize as a person is moving towards the very end of their life? Because there will be things that you see regularly, and those are the things that give you the hunches of when to advise a family not to go home tonight, when to advise a family to get the people who need to travel a significant different distance to get to the bedside. How do you advise families to behave at the bedside? Because, of course, maybe it's just in my house, we love each other very much, and we tend to show that mainly by ignoring each other. But in hospice, people sit by the bedside and they're stroking the hand and they're touching the cheek and they're talking into people's faces. Well, we don't live our lives like that at home. So helping families to arrange the furniture in the room so they can see and hear each other, so they can reach out and touch when they want to, but also to remind them to bring their slippers and bring their newspapers and bring their knitting and settle themselves into the space so that they're not visitors, they are families around a bed. And I want you particularly to think about, how do you narrate the deathbed? How do we make sure that everybody knows what's happening and what to expect next? Because it's telling our stories and telling our stories into the ears of these people that is going to make a difference. Many of you will have read Atul Gawande's Being Mortal, an absolutely magnificent account, a cri de coeur to American medicine about talking to people about what is possible. And his subtitle, Illness, Medicine, and What Matters in the End, is a request to stop escalating treatment and start escalating care towards the end of people's lives. And I found this an absolutely incredible read. My little contribution is this, which is why I'm saluting you all with a cup of tea. And again, it's not clever, it's just people's stories. It's just what we see when we work around deathbeds. But what we need to do is tell the stories so we're giving them back and people remember. There are more books coming along. Rachel Clark's book, Dear Life, again about palliative and end-of-life care. And her latest book, Breathtaking, is out actually this week, which is about her experience during COVID. And there's beautiful books by Christy Watson about nursing and compassion. There are so many stories that we could and must tell so that everybody knows the answers to these questions. What is dying going to be like? And will I be able to bear it? And am I going to leave my family traumatized and terrified? So my last story is the story of Sabine. Sabine was a French lady in the hospice that I very first worked in as a newbie in palliative medicine in the 1980s. And she was afraid. She was afraid that she would be overwhelmed by pain at the end of her life. And she told the nurse who was doing her hair that if she should be overwhelmed by pain, then she would never see her dear deceased husband again. And the nurse had the sense to ask her about that. So Sabine had been a member of the French resistance during the Second World War, and she had married a British airman who'd parachuted in to support her resistance cell by building radios. And she'd come back to England at the end of the war and been married very happily to her husband, who died after a heart attack about 10 years previously. And because she had this French Catholic belief about sin and about heaven, she believed that if she was overwhelmed by pain at the end of her life, she might despair, and despair would be a mortal sin on her deathbed, which would prevent her from going to heaven, which is where she was sure that her husband was. So this was a huge existential fear in this woman's mind that simply presented as a concern about having pain. So my boss took me with him when he went to talk to her, and I thought he was going to go and do a pain consult because I was very young and I thought I knew everything, because that's what happens when you're very young. And what I've discovered as you get older is that you realize more and more how little you know about practically everything. So he was more advanced as a practitioner than I was, and had the humility to sit down and ask her to tell her story. And then he said to her, "Do you think it would help you if I explain to you what dying is likely to be like?" And I was horrified. How could you possibly describe that to somebody? And she said "oui," because she was French, and he also was bilingual. So he asked whether he should speak in French or in English, and she said English, just kind of gesturing at the nurse and myself, who clearly were not going to have French good enough to do that, she realised. So he described to her that, Sabine, what we see towards the very end of people's lives is mainly they just get really tired. They get progressively more weary and they need more sleep to be able to be awake for periods of time. You may already have found that. And she said, "Oui." And he said, "Well, that's good." And I'm thinking, how can that possibly be good? And he said, "No, that's good because it shows us you're following the normal pattern." He said, as time goes by, what we find is that people are more and more tired. They need more and more sleep. They sleep more. They're awake less. And generally by then, we know them well enough that their symptoms, if they have any symptoms, are under reasonable control. Are you troubled much by pain at the moment? No, she said, my pain control is quite good. And he said, I don't expect that to change in a big way now. But if things change and you were to be uncomfortable but not awake enough to take medicines for pain, we would use different ways of giving you pain relief. He said, as time goes by, people sleep more, they're awake less until eventually they slip into being unconscious all of the time. And when we're unconscious, human beings don't manage our breathing anymore. Breathing becomes a reflex, and the reflex is automatic. It's cycles of breathing deep and breathing shallow, and moving from breathing slowly to breathing quickly and back to slowly again. So if your nieces and nephews are around the bed, they may see periods when you're breathing quite fast and breathing quite shallowly, and we will check to make sure you're comfortable, and we will explain to them that this doesn't mean that you're breathless, it just means you're deeply unconscious. And there may be periods where the breathing is deep and it may be coming through a throat that isn't fully relaxed, and so it makes a sighing noise, and we'll check that you're okay, but we will be able to explain to them that it isn't that you're trying to speak, it isn't that you have pain and that you're moaning, it's simply this reflex breathing because you're deeply unconscious. And because we forget to swallow, and because we don't feel even the back of our throat anymore, sometimes the saliva at the back of our throat makes a gurgling noise, a clicking noise, and families find that disturbing, and we will explain that it means that you're so deeply relaxed that you're not even clearing your throat anymore. So what they will see is that there will be faster breathing and slower breathing in cycles, and then there will be slow breathing with pauses, and then there will be a breath out, after which there just isn't another breath in. It's as simple and gentle as that. No sudden rush of pain at the end for you, Sabine. No feeling of choking or fading away. Just very, very gentle. How does that sound? And she kissed his hand and relaxed her shoulders and said thank you, and then told us that we were dismissed now. Thank you. So we're walking up the corridor, and I'm absolutely astonished at what I've just heard, because what I realize is that this is going to change the whole of the rest of my career. That it is within our gift to give people that understanding which brings them that level of peace of mind. And I guess the work of this book and the work that I'm inviting us all to join in is exactly that, that we need to tell our stories. We need people to be ready for their dying the way midwives prepare people for Labour Day. So in advance, that preparation of what to expect, where would you like to give birth, where would you like to be when you're dying, who'll be the carers, who'll be the backup, who will look after the children, who will look after your husband, and then how are we going to monitor you? During pregnancy, we monitor very carefully. During end of life, we need to be monitoring equally carefully. We need those symptoms to be well managed and well recognised early on, with plans for those emergencies that we can anticipate. And the plans need to include step up plans if people become uncomfortable, as well as step back plans. It's always about more care, even if it might be about less intervention. So then we move into the deathbed phase and the companionship of that. So what we're doing is describing to the family and to the person, if they're awake and want that description, what the process is and where we are in it. And yes, has your mum looked as comfortable as this all night? That's fantastic. Have you noticed the breathing is changing in this way? Aren't you doing well to keep this space so safe and comfortable for her? Yes, I'm glad to hear she smiles from time to time. It's interesting she woke up and was able to take a little sip of tea at 3 o'clock in the morning. Well done, you're doing great. Has she been uncomfortable? How's her itching been? How has her nausea been? When did she last wee? When did she last move her bowels? Proactively managing comfort all the way through. explaining what's happening, normalizing the process. And what we're doing is we're allowing families around the bed to begin their stories, which is what they do to console themselves in bereavement and what many families have been robbed of during COVID. So those of us who are looking after people at the end of their lives in COVID, those hospitals that are keeping diaries, well done. That's fantastic to be able to show people what's happened day by day, shift by shift, to the person they weren't able to be with. And every single death that we are participating in the care of then becomes an opportunity to educate people. So when I wrote my book about stories of people dying, I got, I don't know, thousands now of pieces of feedback, letters and emails and social media messages. And these are the sorts of feedback that I get from the public, that their person was in the hospital and they told us that his blood pressure was low, or they told us that their kidneys weren't working very well, or they told us there wasn't enough oxygen in their blood, but nobody told us that they could die. Or they saw the breathing changes and they heard the failure to swallow and clear the back of the throat, and they thought this person was having a terrible time. I had somebody who said to me, I've been in therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder for 5 years since my mum died. And last night I read your story about Sabine and I slept through the night for the first time. Or people who are so courageous that they themselves are dying and they read a book about dying to prepare their families. But it's not okay that people are not prepared. It's not okay that we're leaving people in bereavement like this. And there's feedback from professionals too, that people haven't been aware that we can just use that ordinary language, use our D words, and do it with kindness so that we can really explain in detail what is likely to happen, what the pattern should look like, so that when it goes wrong, people can send for help and retrieve a situation that might in fact be drifting into discomfort. Somebody who wrote to me and said, I've got new scripts now for having those conversations, and when I talk, people really get it. And over again from nurses and from doctors, nobody taught us this in our undergraduate training. So if we are going to change the public understanding of dying, we are going to have to see that every single person we look after offers us the opportunity to educate the whole village of people that's supporting them, so that we can see what's individual and help people to understand the patterns, so that we're using the actual words. The time has come. We've got to talk about dying. We need to narrate every deathbed. We need to change public understanding and expectation of dying. And there isn't another workforce around who's going to do this for us. This is our challenge. This is our precious task. And the time has come. Thank you so much for inviting me. I want to just say in conclusion that although we are a medical audience, we need to remember that dying isn't a medical event, is it? It's the end of a lifetime with people who are precious around that person. It's deeply personal and profoundly social. I think we've got to give dying back to society, and we use stories to enable people to understand that. So good luck, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Kathryn, and kind of as expected, an awful lot of comments already. I love the idea of being ambassadors of transformation. What a fantastic way for, and a takeaway for us to all think about from what you've talked about. So we've got Chris just put into the chat, there's a book which talks to a matter of death and life and how we cope when many people have not been able to be with someone at the end due to COVID, or having to talk to them on a laptop and not being able to hug someone. And Kathryn McDougall has just said, so thought-provoking, Kathryn. Sadly, as well as modern treatments have meant that we extend poor health, and this makes people fearful to let go of their loved one, wanting that last antibiotic or treatment that might mean that they won't die. How do you deal with those ideas and concerns?
I think that's an absolutely brilliant question, and I'm sorry I missed whose name it was, because somehow there's a chat stream that's streaming up the side of my screen.
That's okay.
And you're all amazing. Wow. So I think one of the things that we need to prioritize is conversations about what matters most to people. because what matters most to me right now is to be well and to be able to live into my next several decades. But what mattered to my nana at the age of 97 and 98 was not decades of living. It was quality of living. It was about being with the people who mattered most to her. And by that, then she'd had a major stroke. She was very, very limited in her mobility. And she also was looking forward to being reunited with her husband and her dead son when she died soon, because she wasn't silly. She was 98 and she knew that she would die soon. So we can have those conversations. And I think perhaps if we start the conversation with the sick person, we're less likely to then be presented with, I want you to do this by the family. And I know that most of us try to do that, don't we? That we'll have the conversation with the sick person, with their permission, with their closest people around them. And that's been much, much more difficult during COVID. So very difficult for people. But it's about what matters. And for a lot of people, it isn't extra days. It's the quality of these days that really matters.
Thank you. And there's so many comments, so I'm not going to be able to get through them all, but so we will share everything afterwards just to reassure everybody. I'm just going to pick out a couple before we get into the panel discussion. So Annette has said, thank you, Kathryn. From someone who has not yet witnessed a person dying, as a non-health worker, it's reassuring to hear that this is a normal process that can be planned and cared for. And one of the things I wanted to just ask you, Kathryn, is that often we also see a lot of dom care staff that are young people going in and supporting people at the end of their life. So just picking up Annette's point, how do we get better at giving them the tools they need to do all of the things that you've been talking about?
Isn't that really, really true? So the people who probably are going to see the most end of life care over and over again are people who are working in facilities that look after older people. And we need to empower them. A lot of them are young. They got terrible wages. We don't treat them with the professional respect that they deserve. We are giving them our most precious people to look after and then giving them a wage that suggests that that's not an important task. So I'm not going to go there because we could just get very political,
Yeah.
and we should and we must. But there they are, willing to do this and yet afraid, which is why we end up with out of hours emergency calls that divert those people out of the room that's familiar to them and the faces and voices that are familiar to them into hospital, which is bewildering and wrong and now is full of people who've got masks on and visors on. So it must be terrifying. So we need to see that part of the task of residential care and nursing home care is care to your very last breath, and to be proud of the fact that we will look after you now for the rest of your life. This is your home. We are proud to have you here. We want you to be able to be the best self you can be for all of that time, and we are going to be your companions and we are going to be alongside you. This means advanced care planning is brought forward. It should be part of being admitted to residential care with regular review dates. And it means that those of us who are the experienced death wives need to get alongside those people in care homes and work with them and work alongside them as they're caring for people at the very end of their lives, because they only need to do it right 2 or 3 times to know that they know. And once they know, 2 great things can happen. One is that they can be the death wife that reassures the family, that explains the pattern, that keeps everybody on the page so they don't misinterpret the noises and go into their bereavement traumatized. But also they're able to say, now hang on, this doesn't look normal. And these are the circumstances in which I call the district nurse, I phone the out of hours GP service or whatever the backup is, so that just as showing pregnant women what good maternity standards looked like in the 1960s, 70s and 80s has transformed maternity care, we need people to know what good end of life care looks like. And so public demand will transform end of life care.
Great, thank you so much. So we are going to get into our group discussion now. So this is going to be an open debate. So if I could just ask all our panelists to switch their cameras on to join Kathryn. And our focus is about why the public has become disconnected from dying and the process of dying when it is a natural process. So we have joining Kathryn, Dr. Jane Gibbins, Palliative Care Consultant at Cornwall Hospice Care, Suzanne Adams Joint Lead Practitioner, Specialist Palliative Care at the Royal Cornwall Hospital, Community Specialist Palliative Care Nurse, Joseph Francis, Coordinate My Care Project Manager, Dr. Saskie Dorman, Palliative Care Consultant Regional Clinical Lead for End of Life NHS England, NHS Improvement South West. So thank you so much for all giving what an amazing panel. So I'm really looking forward to a great discussion. And just to set us off really with one question, and then, you know, the floor is open. I'm going to use an experience that I felt privileged to be part of. And that was someone that decided to have her husband at home and with Elvis music playing in his coffin while all his friends came around and had a beer with him. And the whole, as part of that, the trauma that that person experienced in being unable to let that happen. And that was their natural experience, and that was what they wanted. But the system, if you like, fought against that, because I feel that, and you know, as you've so articulated so far today, Kathryn, dying has become so removed from what we do in the public and what we all used to do historically, where people were laid out in the parlour and everybody celebrated. So I just would like to start on that point with you all, really, about how do we get back and how do we all work together to get back to where having a beer and Elvis music playing and going around to see somebody is normal. I've got you all on silence. So would anyone like just to pick
yeah, so maybe if people want to use their raise the hand.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, and again, if you're not presenting, would you mind switching off your camera, please? Thank you.
So I will, Jane, can I just ask that question to you?
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Where's the day gone? My name's Jane Gibbins. I'm a palliative care consultant based here in Cornwall, and we work across all care settings, so hospices, the community and the acute hospital. I very much enjoyed listening to you, Kathryn, and I think one of the ways that we can help with your question, Nikki, is to consider how we prepare our workforce for this. So I teach medical students from the University of Exeter. I feel very privileged to do that. And I was able to do a doctorate around that when I was training with Karen Forbes in Bristol. And it was clear at that time, about 10 years ago now, that we did just as you said, Kathryn, we protect our medical students and we protect our patients so that when they become newly qualified doctors, they will inevitably care for about 40 or 50 patients that are dying. But they don't get openly exposed to those patients, or they don't see that, because when we teach them at medical school, we teach them to make a diagnosis, we teach them to fix a problem, and we teach people to make people better. And of course, that's a really important part of medicine, but with demographic changes, as Kathryn has alluded to, we also know that people live with chronic diseases for a long time, and that all doctors, whatever your specialty, except maybe ophthalmology or dermatology, you are going to care for people that are dying. And so us enabling to get important clinical exposure when they're in medical school is key. So what they used to tell me, and it's again around narratives, we did a qualitative study that they said we didn't see them. So, but why didn't you see them? Because you do 5 years of training, 60% of us will die in an acute hospital, and 70% of us will die from not a sudden illness like a heart attack or stroke. The majority of us are going to die from something that we know about. So what is it that's preventing you from seeing them? And it's multifactorial. It's us as doctors protecting them, and then perhaps protecting themselves. So exposing and making sure that undergraduates need to see patients who are dying in their curriculum, and nursing staff the same. I think nurses are much better at it than doctors, but I think making sure they have that clinical exposure as undergraduates in a safe environment is absolutely key, and that's just one facet.
Thank you. I don't know if any of the rest of you would like to come back on any of those points that Jane has raised. And one thing I just also throw it out to you is in end of life dementia is a good example where people can tend to stop eating and drinking, that family members are continuously then trying to tempt them with food. And is it a confidence? And that becomes very stressful, and people will say, if only someone had just told me that that was part of the process, which is what you said, Kathryn. And then after death, that they actually then are left with that feeling that they should have been trying to feed them more or give them more drink. And again, Saskie, good to know from you, do you think that's a confidence thing in terms of having that conversation? Or what is the barrier to actually being able to say to someone, actually, no, this is the point at which that person is on their natural end of life journey?
I think, thanks Nikki, and thanks Kath for just amazing talk again. Thank you. I think it's a really good question, and I wonder whether it's such a fundamental, it's such a natural thing for us to want the people we love to be able to eat and drink. I mean, that's kind of how we've survived. However, you know, that's how we've evolved, isn't it? We've survived through being able to kind of support each other to eat and drink. So it's utterly expected, really. I think that families should want to help support people in that way. And I think it does, you know, it is part of our roles, you know, that people, as we develop more experience of, you know, that this is a natural part of the process, that of ordinary dying, of normal dying, just as Kath has described, we can help to support people in that transition, that acceptance that we need food and drink as we're in the very last stages of our life. So I think that is a role, and I think Jane is really right about the kind of the importance of education, but I think as well as the kind of importance of education for health and care staff, it is a much wider thing, as Kath has alluded to, this so that whole community, so that, you know, so even globally, but we're all more aware of the processes of dying. And I think your story, Nikki, about you know, that the brilliant kind of, you know, people going around having a beer, Elvis in the background, or, you know, that just sounds brilliant. And I'm reminded of my husband's parents who both died now, but they lived in Ireland. And it was just so normal that after they died, there was an open coffin in the front room, and hundreds came to visit in the days after their death. It was just very normal, we got through a lot of tea. Kath won't be surprised to hear either. Lots of tea, lots of kind of sandwiches, things. But it was just incredible and so different, really, from my experience of having grown up in England. But I think we can do loads to help this become more normal. And one of the things we've just started recently, is like last week, is trying to help connect with people who are, you know, lots of us are grieving behind closed doors at the moment since the pandemic. You know, both so many people have died. You know, in my own family, 3 people have died in my close family over the last few months. My mum died a year ago last September as well, and it just hasn't been you know, obviously it hasn't been a normal experience for anyone during this time. But one of the things that we've just started to do is kind of on a Wednesday evening at 8 o'clock, just lighting a candle in our front room so that people can see it, and as a way to kind of help connect and to kind of acknowledge both the people who've died, but also to connect with others who are grieving, because I think a lot of this just happened in private, and particularly in the pandemic. But let's start to kind of create a culture where it is more normal to be open about this, and I think that is just one small way that we can help to just normalise talking about death and dying and bereavement. So thank you. Sorry, I've touched on lots of different things.
No, that's absolutely good. Thank you for
just such a rich,
so many personal experience. No, really appreciate. Thank you, Jo. Do you mind me calling you Jo or Joseph? And then Kathryn.
I'll respond to anything.
Okay.
Nikki, sorry. So yeah, no, I agree with everything that Jane and Saskie have said already, really, and clearly what Kathryn was discussing within her presentation. And I think I'm in a quite a lucky situation, lucky or not perhaps, where within my relationship at home, I'm married to a psychoanalyst, and so I'm constantly being questioned on the medicalisation aspect of things. And I think actually, to answer your question, it sort of reminds me of discussions that we have together about demedicalising, particularly in mental health, but and in the end of life care. And I think actually normalising death is probably also about demedicalising a lot of it. And Jay and I too have just come from 3 or 4 years of educating the medical students at the University of Exeter. I lead the doctors teachers at the moment, and one of the classic areas that I see that is in the medical humanities sort of section, where there are a lot of efforts going into addressing death in a creative and positive way. And I think that's the sort of stuff that we need to start doing as a sort of grassroots area. But really, we also need to think about how we demedicalise this phase of life. I work in the out of hours GP service, and I know about how there's that sort of consistent desire, as Kath was talking about, to have one last round of antibiotics and to constantly be doing that sort of medical aspect. But I'm reminded of all the other areas in which can really focus positively on aiding in a good end of life and a good death. All the work that the soul midwifery kind of movement has done, and all of that sort of counselling care and all of the just sort of positivity. And yes, absolutely, having some music on and having your sort of family around and getting your favourite drink going, and that should all be part of it. I think what we need to do is continue that grassroots stuff, and I think also we need to absolutely emphasise the support for clinicians, for carers, for other individuals about how a minimalist and or demedicalised, appropriate demedicalisation, obviously, method of sort of attending to those at the end of their life is appropriate and is beneficial. And I think from my perspective as a looking at this from a coordinate my care perspective, I think that this hopefully is going to progress this. I'm hoping that the My CMC area, so the area that allows patients to co-design their end-of-life care with and discuss their spirituality and discuss their preferences and discuss their ceilings of care, will allow us to reduce that data scarcity that we have across the system, and mean that we're all sighted on exactly what this patient wanted and or their families wanted for that sort of care, and therefore that makes it more normal. The patient is in and the person is involved in their own care. They've designed their own care, and it normalizes it from that perspective. So again, sort of as Saskie was saying, just touching on a number of different areas, but I think there are so many things that we could do and are doing, I suppose, to actually sort of normalize this area of care.
Yeah, and Kathryn.
I think this is absolutely fascinating, isn't it? Because it's all about how we make it a community focused thing. And I know that you included consideration of soul midwives and end of life doulas during was it yesterday or the day before, looking at the programme. And full declaration here, so I'm patron of End of Life Doula UK, but all of those movements that are about non-medical people becoming trained to be companions who can just offer that kind of backbone of support and affirmation to families at a point where they might otherwise wonder whether, is this the point where we should be doing something different, dialing 999, all of those sorts of things. We've become very hung up medically on what not to do. And the DNA CPR order is a wonderful marker of that. But actually what to do is the thing that we need to be rehearsing with families. So it's not feeding, it's not giving hydration, it's about tastes for pleasure. It's about those things that bring little moments of reasonably safe pleasure. And so speech and language therapists who will advise us that this is no longer a safe swallow, and for a period in somebody's life it may be they can't be safely fed, but we can suspend those concerns towards the end of somebody's life and allow them to have that little bit. If it's going to be stewed rhubarb for me, just, you know, you are my witnesses. Those really lovely little piquant things that just make a difference, that just make people feel that moment of joy. And rehearsing through with a family and with the family supporter, whether that's an end-of-life doula or a soul midwife, or whether it's their well-known community nurse or their GP, just going through. So when these things happen, when your mum starts to become unconscious all of the time, when your husband's breathing starts to change in this way, what are you going to do? Who are you going to call? Who is going to help you to decide what to do next? So people aren't feeling themselves pushed to a point that feels like a crisis, the crisis being, I'm not sure what to do, rather than there is something terrible happening. And that kind of cognitive rehearsal for what we're going to do, who's going to hold our hand during the decision making, what are the things that will make a difference that allow this person to be in their preferred place. And for this particular diagnosis, for the thing that's wrong with this person, what might be the crises that would say, actually, we've planned all of that, but now this other thing that might happen, this brain tumor that might cause seizures that we can't stop, that's the circumstance in which we need a different plan and a different way of dealing with things. And so this kind of parallel planning, not just for people who are so sick that they might die but might yet recover, but also parallel planning for end of life, which is the way we would hope it will go. And then if it's punctuated by these foreseeable emergencies, what we would do instead. It's all in the planning, and then it's all in the joined upness of the planning, which is where systems like Communicate My Care or whatever the local EPACs is, are going to make such a difference, but only if they join up.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to pick up a couple of comments in the chat at the moment. So there is a lot of people are talking about the use of the word midwife in the dying process. And Emma asks, the use of the word midwife in the dying process feels uncomfortable to me, even as a GP trainee with a strong interest in palliative care. Is there a term that you think is likely to become more mainstream? So can I again ask that question to you, Jane?
Yeah, what a fantastic question. I guess it's about branding, isn't it? It's about how as a population we respond to these words. And I think sometimes I remember coming for an interview in the hospice and how the hospice is branded, and the fact that lots of people are scared about what we do. There's lots of misconceptions. People think that everyone comes here and they're only going to die, whereas we know that we get 50% of people at home. And I seem to spend my life trying to unbrand what a hospice does. So I think that branding and the words that we use around dying, death, are really important. I'm not sure that I've got the imagination of what we would use. And I guess it's part of that bigger picture of how we talk about death and dying openly. I would like it to be called a death something, so that we're using that word death and dying and we know what it is. It is what it's on the tin, and it's not something else that we've wrapped up in another name or that no one really knows what it is. And I think, again, that is about cultures around the words that we use and how we explain dying to people. And we know that we use lots of euphemisms. And although we're trying to do that to be kind, actually it can be extremely unhelpful, because the words deteriorating, the words comfort care, the words palliation, the words terminal all mean so many different things to many different people. So I haven't got a solution to the right name. I just know that I'd like it to be connected and have the word death or dying within it.
Thanks so much, Jane. Just to kind of follow that up, and this to you, Kathryn. Another Kathryn says, I work in urgent care and you are so right. We arrive trying to do our best, but not having had any conversations with the patient or the family or carers. It is so hard at times and very sad. I am really hoping the new ways mentioned yesterday to communicate between us all happen soon. I also think ambassadors and champions in each area would be a good place to start. And in Cornwall, there has been around personalisation, a champions network created through the Billions Institute piece of work. And I just wondered, Kathryn, if you could see this becoming a movement where there are ambassadors, because another comment links to how do we better utilise the voluntary sector, which has been demonstrated during COVID to be, incredibly effective at engaging in communities. So I guess how do we correlate all of this learning and the opportunity and really create a movement around this?
Right, and another absolutely brilliant and $1 million question. So I noticed that alongside that comment of acute responders finding it difficult to walk in and make judgments cold, there's a paramedic has also made a comment on the screen who's from London, and Coordinate My Care will allow paramedics to access planning ahead documents en route to the scene. And I've become very involved with paramedic planning over the last year or so, paramedic education, which has been lovely to enable people to make clinical decisions based on what's in front of them when they arrive, rather than somebody's collapsed and therefore there's a mandatory resuscitation attempt, for example. Families being empowered to say what my dad would not want, and recognizing that a person may or may not have power of attorney, but absolutely knows the heart and mind of the person who the paramedic has been called to see. And we need champions, not just for these individual people, but for the idea that we start to have these conversations. The thing that's going to make a difference to an individual person during their end of life journey is that they're not making it on their own, that they're surrounded by a group of people who I call their village, because just like it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a village to enable a person to die well. And along the peninsula, particularly, you have a sense of community that is not as easily found in big cities, for example, where people can be very proud that our locality does dying well. Falmouth does dying well is a thing for Falmouth to be proud of. And so the ambassadors perhaps are the seeds around which that pearl starts to grow its coats of lustre, that we have death cafes, that we have a healthy end of life doula or soul midwife movement, that we have newspapers that talk about this, and local radio and BBC TV that talks about this, that we are a community that talks about dying. And it's not a news thing, it's a just the way we are thing. So yes, we have to start with champions, but the champions are people who are trying to make this become something that's currency everywhere.
Thank you so much. And this to Joe and Saskie. So from Millie in Bristol, how do we address issues when families or a member of a family shuts down a conversation on death? We had a couple in their 90s, both side by side in Western General Hospital. They had no children or other family, and the miss was dying, and we struggled managing conversations with the husband who expected her to come back home and discharge or expecting to discharge as soon as possible. She will do my tea and has always looked after us both, always. I am not going into care. A combination of things that was traumatic for the team, but sad for the gentleman who had seen 2 wars. Death was not a part of his equation. Any ideas, and anyone that has tried in your areas would be really helpful. So to Joe, I'm just going to ask, do you think the Coordinate My Care will help to support these types of conversations and help to break down some of those barriers? And then to Saskie, just kind of your kind of experience, and again, do you see the role of stories and more of these sharing, as Kathryn has also described, is key to that? So Joe?
The short answer would be yes. I mean, I'm really grateful for Paul saying about his experiences in London. I worked as a paramedic for many years in London, and unfortunately didn't see that rollout. And so it's really interesting to sort of have that insight. I think that, and also Paul, if you can G up our local ambulance services by sending in some case studies, that would be great. Shameless plug. But I think that the aspect of Coordinate My Care that's its unique selling point from a program perspective is that it allows that co-design of care, and that's what's so important. And so as soon as an individual is outlined as being somebody who is appropriate to have a Coordinate My Care record, and bearing in mind that it is just it's a record that is currently used for palliative and end of life care, but London have expanded this to many different areas of urgent care because it is simply a digital shared care record that can be utilised to improve the patient voice. And so when somebody gains the access to that as a patient, they're able to sit down over a time and simply put in those wishes, and there are free text options to discuss all manner of things, even down to a particular, if the person has an insight into that desire not to talk about death, is to not specifically talk about death. I think probably we are so, as a community, this community, death positive, that possibly we could be going and talking about that quite a lot with somebody who absolutely doesn't want to think about it or talk about it. And that's a really important thing that we should also consider, and sort of jogs my memory to think, gosh, maybe when I actually go into my patients at the moment, because I'm death positive in that way, I'm sort of talking about it to people who don't want it, and I haven't read that plan. So absolutely Coordinate My Care with that My CMC portal that is done and completed by the patient or by the patient's proxy, whoever that would be, and is then sent into general practice and community services, will allow that patient voice to be said, and will allow those discussions that you were talking about in terms of patients saying to practitioners who does their dinner, etc. All of that is recorded, and so actually that home visit, 20 minutes from Truro to sort of Redroof, that ambulance call on the route, practitioners are going to be able to look at that and go, okay, I'm informed. I'm so much more informed before I arrive as to how I'm going to be in this patient, instead of arriving, as Paul rightly said, cold, which is currently the position that we're in Cornwall.
Thank you. And Saskie, I mean, I can just relate to the example that was given. At that age, lots of people have got a resilience about life, haven't they? And they've gone through so much that actually the idea that there is some kind of giving up happening, particularly for a partner, if you've had a marriage, if I think about my own parents, they've been married for 60 years, my grandparents were married for 60 years, actually to think about that, somebody going, how do you think stories and the approach that we've been discussing today and what Joe has just described, has described about the Coordinate My Care can help all of this?
Thanks, Nikki, and thanks for the question as well. And I love what Joe said. I've never thought of myself as death positive, but that is a phrase that's going to kind of
stick. I love that.
It's really helpful framing and kind of and grounding actually into back to what others are thinking about all this and their perspectives on it. And you're absolutely right. There are definitely people who haven't really wanted to think about mortality. I think I'm a bit, well, perhaps like lots of us here, I've been thinking about death and dying from quite an early age, but that's probably not normal. So I think it's a really helpful reminder of that. I think the specific, I'm not sure I can comment too much on the specific example. It kind of makes me feel like kind of wanting to get to know the person and kind of hear, chat in a kind of in normal ways about kind of their life and what's important to them. I think others have already alluded on the call that sometimes we can get a bit hung up on advanced care planning as a thing, or a specific tool or a specific plan. It kind of becomes quite medicalized, and I think the more we can help to ground it in a kind of what matters conversation with the person, whether that's the person who's you know, nearing the end of their life, or whether it's someone really close to them, their partner, or, you know, a member of their family or a close friend. I think, or colleagues actually come to that, but I think we can, the more we can help to reframe that as what matters conversations, and kind of meet people where they are, if that makes sense, rather than thinking this has to be about what's going to happen when you die, or what's going to happen when the person you love dies. I think we can start where people are. And thinking about that, also kind of linking back to an earlier part of the conversation about how volunteers can help with that. I'm aware of a couple of places where people are starting to develop kind of I don't want to call it a project as such, but a kind of coordinated approach that people who are volunteers can have conversations with people about what matters to them. And we might have called it advanced care planning, but kind of approaching it from a much more kind of lay perspective rather than a kind of medicalised perspective. And I think that's really exciting, actually. You know, lots, as Kath's talked about, kind of having champions for these kind of conversations, this approach. Actually, the wider we can distribute that, the better. And I think that's a really exciting kind of model. And also linking back into a previous part of the conversation around language, around death and dying, and I think it links back to an earlier day in the conference as well, about some people talk about death cafes, but I've also heard them talk about, you know, there's community wellbeing cafe or friendship cafe, or, you know, there are all sorts of ways that we can help each other to have conversations about what matters, including towards the end of our lives. But we can kind of start with the living and well-being, and kind of move at a safe pace and you know, in a safe way, to thinking about the end of our lives and beyond that.
Thank you.
Kathryn, I kind of taken it. Yeah.
Thank you. Kathryn and Jane, just kind of following on from that, and I just want to pick up something Jane Burnell has raised, which has come up throughout the last 3 days in terms of people with learning disabilities. Kathryn, you probably know what I'm going to say about people with learning disabilities who are admitted to residential services and expected to live there for decades. It's important to make sure that those around know what is important to that person and how they communicate pain or distress. Especially, sorry, I just lost my train there. And it's important for living as well as their dying. Making end-of-life care plans or fit people in their 30s may not be understood by the person or their family, especially if this is seen as a blanket requirement or a tick box exercise. People with learning disabilities can come to understand more about dying than many people suppose. Death must not be a taboo topic in these care settings, but I would really not want to see an end-of-life care plan become compulsory and inflexible part of the admission procedures for young adults who do not have life-limiting illness. So I just would like you both to kind of comment on that. And also, you know, when from a personal, this is going to show my age, when we go back to thinking about nothing about us without us, and a lot of things that came out from the very many care crisis around people with learning disabilities, which unfortunately we still see raise its head all these years later. How do we effectively, because communication with people with learning disabilities can also take longer. We need to employ lots of different tools so that we work in a person-centered way, and the role of advocacy within that as well, where perhaps someone doesn't have capacity. It would be great to know how we take that approach that we've all been discussing and really make that something that is valuable to people who do have learning disabilities and their families.
Yeah, I saw Jane's question come in. Hi, Jane, and I'm so glad that it did. And in fact, my virtual hand was up because I wanted to address it. So I want to say something a little bit more general, first of all, about communities of people for whom cognitive function makes it more difficult to converse, and that the people who know them best will be able to tell us how we know when they are discontented, how we know when they are uncomfortable, but probably even more importantly, how we know when they are contented and how we know when they are comfortable. And that being able to understand that and having that as part of a personal statement of some sort that is available to anybody who might need to deal with that person in a health or social care or other capacities is really, really important. So when we're thinking about people going into residential care because they have an illness or a set of conditions that are causing them to no longer be able to live life independently in the way they did and that are life-threatening, we generally think about the elderly, and at that point, particularly if they have a life-threatening condition, making some kind of advanced plan about how to respond to healthcare threats is really important. But it really is a glorified what matters to me conversation, isn't it? It is still a what matters to me conversation with all my advocates and friends and appointed people to defend my autonomy as much as it can be preserved, helping to represent what matters to me. For younger people who are living with learning disability, I absolutely agree, Jane. I would be absolutely horrified for my niece to go into residential care and my aunt to be immediately asked about an end-of-life care plan for, you know, for my niece in her 30s. But a what matters to me conversation is absolutely the way to start, because whatever the residential care setting is, what matters to that person should be the golden thread that goes through all of the care that any of us provide at any point, and that the care that we offer and the interventions that we offer wrap themselves around producing outcomes that matter for that person. I hope that that starts to address something that is so huge, it's a whole separate conference. And there's some enormous wisdom recorded on the Palliative Care for People with Learning Disabilities website, because they did have a conference about this that I spoke at, and Planning Ahead was included in that. So if that's something that people are interested in, and I know Jane contributed to that as well, I really do advocate people going and having a look at it, because there's a huge amount of wisdom out there and not enough time to talk about it all. Jane, I hope I've said what you feel needed to be said.
Thank you. And Jane, I just wanted to kind of just add on to that, kind of within a hospital setting and with people coming in, perhaps with plans, perhaps with not, perhaps movement between, I'm talking specifically about people with learning disabilities, perhaps with different carers and perhaps with, you know, not all of the communication aids they need. How do you manage that in this kind of difficult, you know, conversation at end of life?
I think it goes back to everything that Kathryn has been saying. So it's about what matters, what happens to, what matters to this person, what are their values, how is the village behind them and around them supporting them, and what is important to them, and do they need to be in an acute hospital setting? Do they really, really need to be here, or could we give them this care in another way? When I think about some of the really positive collaborative working we've had with patients that older patients, so maybe people in their 40s, 50s with learning disabilities that have then developed a malignancy, for example, when we've done our combined oncology clinic. So as a palliative care physician, I sit in a parallel clinic with the oncology doctors so that they can ask me to see anybody that they need to see. I'm part of their team. I'm not labelled as palliative care at that stage. I'm just one of the crew on their team. And that has enabled us to have some really good early conversations with people, not about a death plan, not about a dying plan, but about actually what are the 5 key important things for people when they're diagnosed with an advanced incurable illness. And that's really good symptom control. That's really about timely information. So if the oncologist in their mind think this person might have a year to live, but we only tell them that a month before they die, we've missed those 11 months of being able to help people thinking about what's important to them. We also need to think about their values and what matters to them so that we can listen to their plans and preferences, whatever that might be, whether it means that their extra hair on their moustache needs to come out, whether it's like they like rhubarb and custard, or whether they just like rhubarb on its own. Most people also don't want to be a burden to anybody else. So that village, how are we going to support that village behind them? And then, as Joseph said, we need to connect all that up, because if we deal with the top 4 things, but it's not coordinated between teams, or if I go and sort 2 but not 5 of those problems out, then we need to make sure that that's all joined up and communicated really well using the correct language that everybody understands.
Thank you. And I just want to, based from that as well, Maria's just put, how do the family and individuals involved in end-of-life care of a family member feedback what worked well and what could have been done better, and to tell what parts of the story were overlooked or not heard? And I suppose that also feeds into thinking about how the role potentially that champions could play, and also connection from another point about could all of this then feed into the end of life passport, and I guess Jo, to the Coordinate My Care programme that's underway. So could you just, I know you've got your hand up to respond to something else, so please respond, and then it would just be great to get your thoughts on and understanding of how patients and their families are able to feed back so that it continues to develop from a best practice perspective.
I'm trying to remember what I was. I was simply wanting to just add in that I completely agree surrounding the learning disabilities discussion that we had. And I think actually the reality is that even just simple phrasing, as Jane was saying about sort of preferences of care, that can all be done through coordinated digital care platforms. You know, whether this is Coordinate My Care or not. You know, I'm in charge of rolling this out, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is the right platform. It is a platform, and it's the platform currently that allows that. But it's a coordinated care platform. It's not a. It doesn't have to be a learning disabilities palliative care platform where we instantly start talking about preferences of dying as soon as we get into care homes with or sort of full-time care with should we have those difficulties. So I think it's just about actually where can we store your information and your preferences and plans as to what to do if you deteriorate, so that everybody can see it and everybody can act accordingly. So I think that was what I was coming in to sort of respond about. I think it's just about the sort of terminology and the systems that we use. And currently at the moment we do have a lot of forms that have the word death in them, and it's just simple things like that I think sort of removal of this that actually makes it so much more applicable to the rest of the population. In terms of feedback mechanisms, yeah, I absolutely agree. I think unfortunately there isn't there isn't a direct way of getting this out sort of throughout the system. I think that it's something for me to take away and consider. Actually, I'm not sure about the function of Coordinate My Care and how that would be. I think that throughout the rollout, what we're hoping to do is gain digital Coordinate My Care champions. Those will come from both the train the trainers that we're trying to get in to do the training so that we can disseminate it to the system, so they will become the digital champions. But it will also be those from across the system who are passionate about it, and there will be a governance structure that's being put into place so that actually we can provide that feedback both from a clinical incident perspective, which is just part of good governance, but also from an important perspective of being able to get the patient and the family to feedback on their episodes of care. And so I think that's something for us to take away and look at in the work streams that we're doing. How do we promote that communication even after the death, so that we can make sure that we're really picking that up and we're actually developing our service to respond to that? So absolutely something. So it's apologies that it's not an answer, but it's more a question that's been spawned for me that I need to look at.
No, that's great. Thank you. And Kathryn, just kind of on from that, really. So Jenny has put in talking about changing the culture and normalising death. It would be nice to, as part of the training, even just to start an open conversation. I know from working in a nursing home from age 17, it's something that was never discussed in the training environment, safe place. And my question really is, as we go down to integrated care areas, as we go down to primary care networks, and as we go down to more care at home, we heard the amazing work from Marie Curie yesterday about the pilot that's happening in Cornwall. How do we ensure that those where people aren't in concentrated spaces anymore, that we can actually tell the stories and get the feedback and be able to use that approach which Jenny has used, is to say we need to integrate all of this into training and preparation for all those people that are going out there into people's homes, and may see 20, 30 people, you know, different people across a week in an end of life situation more.
Yeah, absolutely right. It comes back to, as we were discussing before, doesn't it? It needs to be an integrated part of training for people who will be in caring roles, whether that's a local authority pop-in carer who's going to come in and find their usually reasonably sprightly client very different today, whether that's people who are used to delivering bedside care on a regular basis at home or in residential settings. When we're training people who are going to have professional qualifications or people who are going to have qualifications that take them out as carers, the universal healthcare outcome is death. Why is it not on all curricula? Why is it not part of what we're talking about from the very beginning of taking people into training? And the way we train, I think, to start off with, is by telling stories. Now, towards the end of somebody's training, they need some practical hands-on experience, and they need some ways of practicing having conversations. The first time you try to say the D words, it's really hard to make them come out of your mouth. You're fully intending to have that conversation, but actually you just go and put the kettle on. You just go and have a look in your bag for another roll of bandage, whatever. It's just so difficult. So we need to put people into situations where they're practicing having those conversations, even just with each other in a classroom, as 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds who are going to go out and be part of a caring service. And there's no substitute for practice. It's impossible to practice confidently for the first time beside a dying person in the room with distressed family. What you will remember is the distress, not how you conducted yourself and whether there was anything to learn from it. So we have to help people to have real opportunities to practice this as part of their training. We have to give them feedback, and we have to help them to take ownership when it goes well, so they look back on an episode of care that ended in a death not being a life lost, but a death saved, and that they were part of saving that death and translating it into something that the family can take into their bereavement, understanding what happened.
Thank you, Saskie. You've got your hand up.
Thank you, and that's such a beautiful way of saying it. And I'm really, that what you talked about earlier, Kath, about say for someone working in a care home who only has to look after someone who's dying twice, 3 times to kind of build that confidence to know that it is okay and I can do this. And I just think that is reflected throughout all of our training, isn't it? Whether we're trained to be doctors or trained to be nurses or whatever we're trained to be, we just need to kind of be supportive to do it well a few times to start to gain confidence and then help to spread that confidence. And I'll link back in as well about the learning from families' kind of feedback about their experiences, because I think it's a really crucial point, and it's something that there's several different models of doing that. I think some on a very one-to-one basis where we having that conversation with someone about kind of how they felt things went and what we could have done differently and all those sorts of things. I think there's a kind of growing recognition that things like the friends and family test just really doesn't really do it. That's not a great tool to use at end of life. But there are some other models as well, and so there are several platforms for it as ways to do this, but one example that I'm aware of is Care Opinion, and that's a freely available, in the public domain. Any of us having experienced some episode of care, whether it was a kind of hernia operation or end of life care for someone we love, we can go onto that website and anonymously share our experiences or our story or what we thought of that care and that experience anonymously online, and it's visible virtually in real time. So within hours, that both it's up on the website, but also the people involved in that, the organisation who have you know, like the hospital or the GP practice or whoever was kind of providing that care, also get a notification to say that this new experience or story has been shared, and they get the opportunity to respond to it. So then, although it's anonymous from the person's point of view who's sharing their experience, the person who's responding to it can it says who they are, and it can be kind of the beginnings of a conversational dialogue kind of in the public domain online. And I think that's really helpful, because not only is it helping staff to appreciate the things that matter to people towards the end of life, and both what went well, but also where the challenges are or what could have been different. But it also, it shares the stories in the public space. Anyone who's, you know, if you're thinking about, I don't know, lots of people are scared of hospices, aren't they? Because they associate with death and dying. But actually, if you can go online and see that lots of people have actually really appreciated the kind of the care that was provided there, it can help to kind of demystify it and to make it feel safer. So I really like that kind of element of it being in the public domain and visible to everyone. And I think there's also some, I think it helps because sometimes when we're in the kind of in our roles, we can kind of get a bit bound up with protocols and procedures and the way we do things. But actually what we went into healthcare or, you know, supporting people was a different thing than following a protocol. It was more to do with a generosity, compassion, caring, nurturing, you know, lots of different things. It might be different things for different people, but there's a different kind of sense there. And actually, if people in what they're expressing about what they value about care is all that compassion and kindness and dignity and generosity, all those things, that to me feels like it could be really helpful and sort of sustaining for the staff and the people involved in giving this care, if we can see how much that's valued. So it was just an idea, I suppose, about kind of one way to kind of help to make those stories more visible. And then the other thing to say, I know Joe was talking about how we can kind of help to systematically kind of gain reflection as well. It's something that we've been thinking about, and Jane will be aware as well that we're kind of thinking about how we can, across the South West, kind of have a better sense of whether what matters to people towards the end of life is actually what's happening. And we're trying to kind of work on a way to do that in a systematic way, without being a burden during people's grieving process, or, you know, but importantly being able to hear from them. So if any of you on the call would like to be part of that, then we'd really like to hear from you. Just let us know. If I put my email in the chat, so that you'd let us know if you'd like to be part of thinking about that, and that's something we want to do across the region. Sorry, Kath, I know you've opened up.
Thank you so much, Saskie. Jane, so we've got Gina who's asking, how are these conversations happening in hospitals at the moment? It must be emotionally difficult for the teams. And we've also, although I can't see them, we've got Sue and Janet from the specialist care nurses, and I'd love to also get their view about how that's happening in the community at the moment as well, and perhaps how the two things are linking together. So Jane, over to you. You're on mute.
I'm sorry. Is Suzanne Adams here? Because she's the lead of the palliative care team in the hospital. I think she's on the panel, so I think she might be better placed at the moment.
I can see Suzanne's put a comment in the chat, but
Here she is.
There she is. It'd be great if anyone's on the panel. It'd be just great to have your photo, so your pictures up so I can see you.
Yeah, it is very difficult at the moment in the hospital. There's no doubt about that. And I think what struck me right from the start of COVID is how acutely the absence of families has been felt by the staff. You know, it's been really difficult for the teams. And, you know, there's been look at us today, but there's been a great increase in the use of technology. We have iPads and obviously we're having a lot more conversations over the telephone. And I think it is about finding, listening to Kathryn's talk earlier on, it was fantastic. And a lot of that resonated with our experiences in the hospital. But it is about trying to find the beauty and grace in that experience where you can, and that is a challenge, there's no doubt. But recording more around the experience of end of life is something that we're really encouraging staff to do, to fill those gaps for families who can't be there. Even if people live locally, it's difficult for people to come in. They may be shielding themselves, so there are numerous challenges for people to overcome, and I think that's, as I say, doubly difficult for staff as well.
Are you still there, Nikki?
Sorry, I was on mute myself then. That button. Yeah, Sue and Janet, it'd be just great to kind of get your view, if you're there, from a community point of view as well, how you're managing those conversations. I'm not sure if I've got them here or not.
Are you available, Janet?
Hello.
Janet?
Hi.
Oh,
Hi. Yes, I mean, extra difficult really, just having to let people know about the difficulties of visiting and being with loved ones in establishments, and obviously lots of people more reluctant to be admitted and wanting to stay at home, which is fine when death is normal and going as planned, but more difficult when things are complex. So a lot of the deaths at home that are more normalised are managed by the district nursing team. So a lot of the ones that we're dealing with are specialists in complex in nature. So it can be quite hard to get people what they want, because it's not only a time where it's difficult to be admitted, but actually resources are quite stretched in the community. So I don't know if that's particularly in Cornwall or whether that's more widely across the southwest.
Thanks ever so much. I just want to pick up, because we're running out of time, but I just want to pick up a couple of points in the comments. So from Anna, how do our graduating death doulas link better up with structures of end-of-life care? We have increasing numbers of trained doulas coming into the system, but often making these connections locally with those coordinating end-of-life care can feel impenetrable. So Kathryn, I'd like to start with you on that, because it's an interesting word, impenetrable, and we also talk about barriers a lot of the time. So it'd just be great to have your kind of thoughts on that. You're on mute. It's all right, we're all doing it now. I can tell that it's a Friday afternoon.
The tea levels are dropping. I'm sorry now, I've lost the question in my kerfuffle. Tell me the beginning. What are we talking about being impenetrable?
The doulas wanting to come into the system and make connections, but finding that very, well, impenetrable is the word.
It is really interesting, isn't it? And I have been thinking about this, obviously, because I have this liaison role with end-of-life doula, and I'm also in contact with a lot of people who describe themselves as sole midwives, and they're very, very similar roles. We have a workforce here of people who are willing and able to be alongside people in the way that they decide they want somebody to be alongside them. They have the skills to work out how that is, and to blend alongside different types of families and different types of individuals. And it is interesting that it's difficult for the NHS particularly to welcome people who are not part of the workforce. And every NHS trust that you look at that has volunteers experiences this difficulty of particularly getting the volunteers who want to be patient facing to be alongside people, whether that's community or hospital. I know hospices who have welcomed end-of-life doulas and sole midwives, and other hospices who've been very, very suspicious of what kind of oddness is this. And I think until you've had somebody working in your ranks and being able to see what they can offer, you're not going to be able to discover. And I heard a wonderful story at an end-of-life doula conference where one of the doulas is also a matron for services within a hospital in Yorkshire, and being able to use doulas who are trained by the End of Life Doula organisation to come in and work alongside patients was something that seemed to her to be a simple thing. She's in a management position, it ought to be easy to do it, and yet it's been very, very difficult to allow that change to happen. What she has been able to do, though, wearing her doula hat, is work in a different way when she was not at work within her hospital, and be able to open people's eyes to the experience. For example, the story she told was of a patient dying in a 6-bedded bay. Now we all know the 6-bedded bay. Yes, we've all been in the 6-bedded bay, and we know that we have soundproof curtains around each bed. And so one lady is dying in a 6-bedded bay, and 5 ladies are listening to the noises and are listening to the weeping family and are drawing their own conclusions and being told nothing. And by being able to do a ward round of those other 5 people, to ask them what they can hear, to enable them to understand and not be terrified by what they can hear, she was able to enable them to be supporters rather than people complaining about the noise in that room while that person was dying. Now that's transformational, and that's something that ward staff probably don't have time to do. So we need to start to think in a different way about bringing our communities to walk alongside us in community care in people's own homes, in community care in care homes where end-of-life doulas, soul midwives, whatever title they're working to, could be those trainers of those young carers and could be the mentors of those young carers. And we also need to think about, how do we accredit teams for their excellence in end-of-life care? Imagine I'm going to choose my care home, and I want to choose a care home that's got a qualification that it's regained on several occasions that says we have an accreditation in excellence in end-of-life care. And maybe it says, and we're supported to achieve that by St. Local's Hospice, with whom we have a telephone helpline any time of the day or night. So let's start to think about, what have we got locally? Who have we got locally? And who are the people in our community who could be helping us with this, who've got the confidence, who've got the training, but actually we haven't yet discovered a way of bringing them into the way that we work.
Very much. And yesterday we heard from Felicity about the role of the soul midwives, and again, as you say, those people that are giving up their time as volunteers or otherwise, and can work alongside core services, often potentially as well with a lot of experience. I'm really sad that we have to kind of bring this to a close shortly, but I wanted to ask, I just check with Saskie, is that a dormant hand, Saskie, or have I missed you? That's all right.
Could I just come in very quickly, Nikki?
Yeah, of course.
About this, particularly about the engaging with the kind of wider system, the kind of death doulas and soul midwives engaging. So everyone on the call and other, and others who are involved in that work, really welcome to join the South West End of Life Care Network. And we've actually got a call. It's a fortnightly call on a Thursday lunchtime. There's one next week. With Tommy Whitelaw, who will be amazing. But there's one on the 4th of March, which is with a soul midwife or death doula, also who's involved in Death Cafe. But I think that might be a really helpful way for people to kind of feel more connected with others who are kind of involved in this area of work. So I'll put the email in the chat if you want to let us know if you want to kind of join that. You're very welcome. It's free to attend. It's via Teams like this.
Okay, so to the panel, just a final question. Linda from Carnan Down Surgery. Can I ask the panel to share their thoughts about resources, both financial and human? I care for patients who die in their own homes alongside enormously overstretched community nursing teams and home carers who are underpaid and under-recognised, and that there are insufficient people who want the job. All of us care deeply about doing this well and prioritising this care over the many other demands upon us. It's very rewarding, but resource heavy. There is no slack left in any of our working days and an extra 10 minutes to hear more about what is important to someone, or to reassure a frightened family, or complete care plans is one less appointment for another concerned soul, or more often another delay in getting home to our own families. We need compassion for ourselves and each other, and recognition this work needs time and resource as much as life-saving hospital care. How can we achieve parity for this important work? Big question for the last one, but I definitely think it's, I'd love to open it up to the panel just for any of you to be able to respond.
I think we've been undervaluing community forever, that actually we need to reinvent the way we work as a whole healthcare system so that care that's presented closer to home reduces reliance on hospitals and hospital admission. And that is a huge, huge political challenge. In the meanwhile, I want to absolutely respect staff who say, I cannot do that and remain well. I cannot do that and be the mother that I need to be at home. And if I'm not the mother that I need to be at home, I will not be well. And we really have to say that it is all right to say when we're not okay. So the proper resourcing and the proper recognition of community is a gap. It absolutely is a gap. And it will take political will, but in the meanwhile, for you to leave feeling that you could have done more and didn't, or that you had to choose between the best care you could provide for that family and no care for another family, or leaving gaps in order to see that second family, I hear you, and it is heartbreaking. And we have to address it for you. I don't have an answer, but I do think that if you knew that there was a parallel workforce, perhaps of trained individuals in the community, like end-of-life doulas and soul midwives, that you worked closely enough with regularly enough to know to trust them, that could be a really helpful thing. But I know that there's a reservation about giving away that really precious part of the nursing role to somebody else. It's the same challenge that we see in hospitals sometimes with referral to palliative care, where the preciousness of that last part of life people don't want to give away. And it's understanding that we're not giving away, we're sharing, we're co-working, and nobody loses but the patient gains.
Thank you very much. And unfortunately, we're going to have to call the panel discussion to an end there. I want to thank you all so much for all of your valuable insights. Absolutely fantastic discussion. Thank you for everybody for contributing. And now, just to round us off on our last day, I'm going to hand over to Gina Starnes, who's the Director of Clinical Care, Clinical Services for Cornwall Hospice Care.
Thank you, Nikki, and what a lovely job for me to do to sum up 3 really wonderful afternoons that have certainly reignited my connection with what's important around end of life. And I think a lot of us have been in the game for quite a long time, and sometimes actually you need the words and thoughts of each other to actually just support you and to keep you going, particularly at this difficult time. So we've heard, and everybody's contributed to so much, both adult children's hospices, how our acute colleagues have managed and worked, particularly during this difficult time. And we've learnt, actually, for me, the key thing, I think, has been that our community is just so important, and that our strength is very much togetherness. We've heard how, you know, things that people have read, things that education centres can offer, is available to support each other. And I think it's about us taking the time to take advantage of that, really. So I think the key thing for me really has been that importance of working together. And also what really resonated was to use a language that we all understand, that we're part of this dying support network. Dying Matters Week is the 10th to 16th of May. It's an opportunity for all of us to talk about death, dying and bereavement in a language that's clear and uncloaked, and one that we all kind of understand. And certainly for me at the moment, who's having lasting power of attorney discussions with her 87-year-old father who's moved in, There is a certain, I think, generation that don't want to discuss it, that think it's not going to happen, but actually it's finding those ways of getting round to those difficult discussions, and just making sure that we share that what we want to do is to do it well and to do it right by those people that we love and care for. So my final message, and could I have the next slide, please? Sorry, I've wanted to do that, you see, for so long, Mr. Johnson. But can we just remember to keep talking together? It's really important that those lasting memories are very much about how we have those conversations. Talk about us, talk about each other. It's hashtag end of life with a capital E, and perhaps we can trend just as much as hashtag Handforth Parish Council have done in the last 24 hours. And I just leave you with thoughts on a slide from Margaret Wheatley, who was an American author. Just that there is no power for change greater than a community discovering what it cares about. And certainly the last 3 days have really shown actually what we're about in Cornwall. So thank you all very much for participating.
Thank you so much, Gina. I really appreciate that plenary, and what a great way for us all to end the conference. So I want to say thank you. Honestly, it's been my honour to chair this over the last 3 days. And I'm just trying to, I've got so many notes, as you will all see, on all the amazing things that have come out with it and all the things I've wanted to remember to say. But all I really want to say is stay safe. Have a great weekend, everybody who's contributed. Go home and relax now. And let's see how we can take all of this work forward over the next few months. As we said at the very beginning of the conference, we will be sharing all of the information. You will have a CBD certificate. Please fill in the survey. We do want to learn from it. We are going to be starting a newsletter. We'd love some of our panelists to contribute to that today. The idea of setting up a champions network would be absolutely amazing. And let's see if that's something that we could take forward as an outcome from these last 3 days of the seminar. So thank you once again. Have a great weekend and goodbye.
Thank you everybody.
Thank you. It's amazing.
Thank you.
Hey, well done.
Well done, team, and relax.
Hey, we're done. 3 days. Hi, Kathryn. Nice to meet you.
Hi,
I'm one of
lovely
the
to see you.
team.
That was fantastic.
I sit in the background of these two amazing ladies that have organised it all. Well, 3 ladies. Sorry, Nikki. I was looking at Lolly and Tracy.
No,
sorry,
I didn't
amazing
it.
ladies.
No.
Wow.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Really emotional,
Absolutely
actually, wasn't it?
Yeah.
We covered a lot of ground there.
Yeah.
I will tell you one
And-
thing. I actually ordered my power of attorney forms and they came this morning. So I've already told my daughter now how I want my hairbrush. And if I get anyone that's going to do it wrong, it just winds me up. So I'm going right down to the detail after this 3 days.
Right. I think I've got tweezers in mine, you know, just to kind of make sure it's all okay.
There's some really good, robust conversations happening, which is thrilling. So that's entirely the point of this.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say, what did you think? Did you kind of feel we had a rich enough discussion? It's always great to get the feedback from all of you.
I think that's one of the best discussions I've ever been at. I think it was absolutely wonderful. And what's really interesting is that sense of place that the peninsula has. So I got family in Devon, in Exmouth, but one of my best friends from school lives in Falmouth, which is why I chose Falmouth as my example. And I always feel that sense of, a bit like up here in the northeast of England, you know, we are not as others are. And I know that the people down in the southwest feel the same, that we're very particular. And even if you've got that Devon Cornwall divide, because obviously if you're not from Cornwall, you're nobody. There's that sense of place, isn't there, of who we are and what we're about. And I think that's a really great strength. I think we're going to be able to use it up here in the northeast in the same way. You know, Geordies are going to do dying the Geordie way. and all of that London nonsense. No, you can keep it because we're Geordies and we do it like this. And I think you've got that to build on as well down in the Southwest. And it's just very obvious from the questions. How can the community get involved? What can the community do? All of that. When you go through the questions on the strand,
Yeah,
it's all about how are we going to do this here? Nobody's saying how have Birmingham solved it, are they? It's what are we going to do here?
yeah.
It was
Very,
brilliant.
you could feel people's emotion, and I think that's really important. It's like when you feel, it doesn't just feel like we're just all at a distance. You kind of feel like you're all connected. That's what's always really, this particular 3 days, I think, has been like that, which is lovely. You just want to carry that forward, don't you now?
Yeah. It's clearly
everybody wants the same thing.
Yeah.
Everyone wants the same thing, don't they? They all want to join and make this better. So it's using the energy that these kinds of sessions germinate to move it forward. So it was, it's fantastic. I'm a little bit overwhelmed actually by the amount of.
But it's Friday.
Yeah.
You lot must be absolutely exhausted because you've been thinking non-stop and got all that kind of organiser anxiety at the same time. Wow.
Just a bit.
I wonder how long it's going to take you to come down.
I'm going for a long walk. But it is, you do feel, I always think when people share their own experiences, though, even as you're trying to share it, when you bring it to a close, it's quite emotional.
Yeah.
I don't think I'd be doing my job properly if I didn't feel like that.
No, that's when you need to check in with yourself. And well done, Kathryn, because you've been under your own pressures to get here today. And, you know, you must have had an enormous celebration on Friday night, was it?
No, when I sent it away and then immediately thought, oh, I haven't said this and I haven't said that. And I discovered today I reordered all the chapters, but I haven't changed the chapter numbers. So my husband's saying to me, there's a chunk missing because it's chapter 6 and then it's chapter 10. I think, oh my God, this has gone to the publisher. Like, so
that's what an editor's for, don't worry.
Yeah, and next week it all has to be rewritten when all of the comments come back, but it's okay. It's okay. This weekend we can all just
Relax.
Yeah.
Can't wait to see it. Can't wait to read it, Kathryn.
Yeah, thank you so much. I've learned so much.
That's been absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, thank you, and brilliant stuff. The whole 3 days was really good.
Yeah.
Thanks, Saskie.
Well,
I look forward to the next one.
I hope it builds into something wonderful for you all, and I'd love to hear what happens.
Oh, listen, I've literally got pages of ideas now. Don't think you guys down at the hospice are getting off lightly, because I've got loads of ideas from this.
Bring it on, Evie, bring it on.
We're all over it. So go well, everybody.
You too.
Next one, Jane, you're on. T-shirt to the ready.
Yeah, Jane, Lolly. Definitely.
See you.
Can you hear me?
Just
who's that? Jane. Hi, darling.
Thank you for